The Italian leather shoe came down slowly, grinding the burger into the marble floor. "No gloves, Mark. Pick it up with your hands." Mark's fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the math. $100 per scrap. His daughter needed $80,000 by morning. He knelt down, peeling cheese and beef off polished stone, while his former employee watched from above. What the CEO didn't know, the homeless woman Mark married 3 years ago, the one he found dying by the roadside, was making a phone call that would buy this entire building before sunrise. The plastic bucket beside Mark held more than dirty water. It held 3 years of silence and 1 night of reckoning. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous note, while Mark's fingers, hands that had once written algorithms worth millions, peeled processed cheese off polished stone. His back ached in the place it always did, right between the shoulder blades where tension gathered like sediment. He could feel the eyes of the late-night security team pretending not to watch from the elevator bank. This was the 47th floor of Apex Technology, the building Mark had helped design the security infrastructure for back when his name was on the 3rd floor directory, and Julian Vane was still calling him Sir. That was before the patent theft, before the falsified documents that made it look like Mark had sold trade secrets to a Korean firm, before the quiet settlement that had saved him from prison but cost him everything else. "You're thinking too hard, Mark." Julian crouched down, close enough that Mark could smell the scotch on his breath. Expensive scotch, the kind Mark used to drink at product launches. "Just pick up the meat. Your daughter's waiting, isn't she?" Mark's jaw tightened. He'd learned not to respond to Julian's provocations. The man fed on reactions the way some people fed on affirmation. Instead, Mark focused on the task, 1 piece at a time. He counted silently. 11, 12, 13. Each scrap went into the small plastic bag Julian had provided, the kind you'd use for a child's sandwich. The humiliation had a specific shape to it, carefully designed, and Mark recognized the architecture of cruelty because he'd spent 3 years studying it. The plastic bucket beside him was the same one he'd used every night for 36 months. Cracked yellow, the handle wrapped in duct tape. Sarah had asked him once why he didn't just take a new one from the supply closet. He'd told her it was because this one still worked. The truth was more complicated. The bucket had been there the night everything fell apart, and keeping it felt like keeping a witness, something that knew the whole story. 17, Julian said, straightening. He pulled a money clip from his pocket, peeled off bills with theatrical precision. "That's $1,700. Not bad for 5 minutes of work." He dropped the cash on the floor, just far enough that Mark would have to reach for it. "Better than what you'd make coding, right?" "Oh, wait. You don't do that anymore." Mark picked up the money without comment. It smelled like leather and cologne. He folded it once, slipped it into his shirt pocket, and stood. His knees cracked. He was 32 but felt older in moments like this, when the distance between who he'd been and who he'd become stretched out like a canyon he'd never cross back over. "Same time tomorrow?" Julian asked, already turning toward his office. "I'm thinking barbecue ribs. Really test those talented fingers of yours." The elevator doors closed before Mark could formulate a response he'd never give anyway. He stood alone on the 47th floor, surrounded by glass walls that looked out over Manhattan, the city glittering like a promise it had never made to him. Somewhere down there, in a 4th floor walk-up in Queens, Sarah would be waiting. She'd have heated soup from the food bank, and she'd ask about his night with that careful lightness she'd developed, the tone that didn't press but left space for him to fill if he wanted. He never wanted. Mark turned back to his bucket. The water inside had gone cold hours ago, tinged gray with the residue of 1,000 polished floors. He picked it up by the duct-taped handle and headed toward the service elevator, the one the cleaning staff used, the one that didn't have mirrors or soft lighting or the gentle voice announcing floors. His reflection caught in the dark windows as he walked, a man in gray coveralls, hair that needed cutting, shoulders that had learned to curve inward. 3 years ago, almost to the day, he'd been standing in this same building wearing a suit that cost more than his current monthly salary. He'd been explaining cloud architecture to a room full of investors, and Julian had been in the back row, taking notes. Mark had thought they were friends. That was the first mistake. The second was trusting that friendship meant anything when money was involved. The third was thinking he could fight back through legal channels, that justice had anything to do with truth. The service elevator smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. Mark leaned against the metal wall and felt the $1,700 in his pocket. It would cover 2 weeks of Lily's medications, maybe 3 if he stretched. But the surgery, the real surgery, the one that would fix the valve defect in her heart, that needed $80,000 that might as well have been $80 million. He'd tried everything legal. Loans, grants, charity programs. They all had waiting lists or income requirements or clauses that disqualified him for reasons that sounded reasonable when spoken aloud, but felt like locked doors when you were standing outside them. The hospital had given him until Monday. Today was Friday. In 72 hours, his daughter's name would drop off the surgical schedule, and they'd start talking about palliative care, which was a gentle way of saying they'd make her comfortable while she died. The elevator opened onto the subterranean parking garage. Mark's car was a 15-year-old Honda with a cracked windshield and a check engine light that had been on so long he'd stopped seeing it. He loaded his bucket into the trunk next to the spare tire that had never been spare, just the regular tire he'd been meaning to replace for 8 months. The drive home took 40 minutes. Traffic was light this time of night, past 2 in the morning, but Mark drove carefully anyway. He couldn't afford a ticket, couldn't afford the insurance increase, couldn't afford much of anything except the careful arithmetic of survival. He passed the bodega where Sarah bought day-old bread, the laundromat where they washed clothes by hand to save quarters, the elementary school where Lily had gone before she got too sick to attend. Their apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like curry and old carpet. The elevator had been broken for 6 months. Mark took the stairs slowly, feeling each of his 32 years in his knees. The hallway light flickered, through shadows that moved like living things. He unlocked 3 deadbolts, the original, the one he'd added, and the one Sarah had insisted on after the break-in 2 doors down. The apartment was dark, except for the small lamp Sarah kept on in the kitchen. She was asleep on the couch, wrapped in the Afghan her mother had made, before her mother had decided that marrying a disgraced engineer was grounds for disowning. A library book lay open on her chest, something about urban gardening. Sarah was always reading about things they couldn't afford to do, dreaming in a way that Mark had lost the capacity for. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. Really looked. She'd lost weight in the 3 years they'd been together, not from illness, but from the slow erosion of living at the margins. Her hair, which had been dark and thick when he'd found her, now showed threads of early gray. But there was something else too, something he couldn't quite name. A quietness around her eyes. A way of holding herself that suggested she was always listening for something he couldn't hear. Mark had found Sarah on a rainy night in November, 3 years and 2 months ago. She'd been lying at the edge of Riverside Park, soaked through, bleeding from a head wound. No ID, no phone, no memory of who she was or how she'd gotten there. He'd called 911, waited with her until the ambulance came, then showed up at the hospital the next day, because something about the way she'd looked at him, confused but not afraid, lost but not broken, had stayed with him. She'd had no one. Amnesia, the doctors said, possibly permanent. Social services wanted to place her in a group home. Mark had been there when they explained this to her, watched her face go carefully blank in a way that reminded him of how he'd looked when his lawyer told him to take the settlement. He'd said, "She can stay with me," before his brain caught up with his mouth. That had been the pattern of their relationship. Him offering things before thinking them through, her accepting with a quiet gratitude that never quite felt like gratitude, more like recognition. They'd married 6 months later, partly for health insurance, partly because Lily had asked if Sarah could be her mom, and Sarah had cried, the only time he'd seen her cry, and said yes. Mark moved quietly through the apartment, checking on Lily in the small bedroom they'd converted from a walk-in closet. His daughter was asleep, her breathing shallow but steady, the portable oxygen concentrator humming beside her bed. She looked younger than 8 when she slept, smaller. He touched her forehead lightly, no fever, and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. In the kitchen, he emptied his pockets. The $1,700 went into the envelope marked Lily. Surgery, which now held $4,300, not even 6% of what they needed. The math sat in his stomach like a stone. He made coffee not because he wanted it, but because the routine of it, measure, pour, wait, gave his hands something to do besides shake. The kitchen window looked out onto an air shaft. No view except other people's windows, other people's lives. But tonight, Mark noticed something odd. The apartment directly across, which had been empty for months, now showed a faint light. He watched for a moment, saw a shadow move past the window. New neighbors. He felt nothing about this information. His capacity for curiosity had diminished, along with everything else. "You're home." Mark turned. Sarah stood in the doorway, the Afghan still wrapped around her shoulders. Her voice was soft, always soft, like she was afraid of taking up too much space in the world. He'd asked her once why she talked that way. She'd said she didn't know, that maybe before the amnesia she'd been loud, or maybe she'd always been quiet. "Maybe I'm just a quiet person," she'd said, and he'd let it go because pushing felt cruel. "Yeah," Mark said. Late night, Sarah moved into the kitchen, poured herself coffee he hadn't realized he'd made enough of. She had a way of moving through space that was economical, no wasted motion. He'd noticed it the first week she'd lived with them. She could fold laundry in half the time it took him, could navigate the apartment in the dark without stumbling, could catch Lily's juice cup before it fell, with reflexes that seemed too sharp for someone who'd had a traumatic brain injury. "How much?" she asked. He didn't have to ask what she meant. $1,700. She nodded once, sipped her coffee. "That's good." It wasn't good. They both knew it wasn't good. But Sarah had this way of reframing things, of treating small gains like victories, because the alternative was drowning. She set down her cup, looked at him directly. "I found something today." Mark felt his chest tighten. The last time Sarah had said those words, she'd found a free clinic that would see Lily. The time before that, a food bank that didn't ask questions. What kind of something? A way to get the money. The kitchen suddenly felt very small. Mark set down his own cup carefully. "What way?" Sarah's eyes, gray in some lights, blue in others, held his. "There's a man who owes you. Julian Vane. He stole your work, destroyed your career. He has the money. All of it and more. We've been through this," Mark said, keeping his voice level. The settlement agreement was signed under duress. Your lawyer was incompetent. The evidence was manufactured." Sarah's voice stayed soft, but something underneath it had hardened. "And Julian's current project, this omni-security system he's launching tomorrow, it's built on your original code, your architecture." Mark stared at her. "How do you know that?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled a folder from beneath the couch cushions, he hadn't noticed it there, and set it on the counter between them. Inside were printouts, screenshots, code fragments. Mark recognized his own work immediately, saw where Julian had modified variable names, restructured functions, but kept the core logic intact. Where did you get this? His voice came out rougher than intended. Does it matter? Sarah's hand rested on top of the folder. Her fingers were slender, unadorned except for the simple wedding band he'd bought at a pawn shop. What matters is that tomorrow night, during the launch event, something's going to happen. Something that will prove Julian's been lying. And when it does, you need to be ready. Ready for what? To fix it. To show everyone what he can't do without you. She paused. To take back what he stole. Mark's mind was moving through possibilities, through legal ramifications, through the 100 ways this could go wrong. You're talking about sabotage. I'm talking about justice. Those aren't the same thing. They are when your daughter is dying. The word hung in the air between them. Dying. They didn't usually say it so plainly. They talked about the surgery, about recovery, about what Lily would do when she felt better. But Sarah had cut through the euphemisms like they were fog, and now Mark could see clearly to the other side. How? He asked. Sarah pulled out her phone. An old model, cracked screen, but she used it with the fluid competence of someone who'd grown up with technology. She pulled up a video file. This is tomorrow night's launch event. 500 guests. Live stream to 50,000 more. Julian's betting everything on this demonstration working perfectly. And it won't? Not unless someone who actually understands the architecture is there to fix it. She looked at him. You. Mark watched the video play. He saw the stage setup, the massive screens, Julian's practiced smile. Who sent you this? A friend. You don't have friends. You can't remember anyone from before. Something flickered across Sarah's face, too quick to read. I have friends now. It wasn't an answer. Mark realized, suddenly and completely, that he didn't know his wife at all. She'd been living in his apartment for 3 years, sleeping in his bed, raising his daughter, and he couldn't name a single person she'd spent time with. She went out during the day, to libraries, she said, to the park. But he'd never followed up, never asked for details. He'd been too buried in his own survival to question hers. Sarah. He said her name carefully. What's really going on? She met his eyes without flinching. I'm saving our daughter, and I'm giving you back your life. She closed the folder. Tomorrow night, 8 p.m., the Apex Technology headquarters, 47th floor. Be ready when the system crashes. Julian will call you. He won't have a choice. And when he does, you go up there and you fix it. But this time, you make sure everyone knows exactly who built it. And then what? He just confesses? Hands over $80,000? More than that. Sarah's voice dropped lower. A lot more than that. Mark wanted to ask how she could possibly know any of this, wanted to demand answers about the folder, the video, the certainty in her voice. But a part of him, the part that had learned to accept small miracles without interrogating them, stayed quiet. He needed this to work. Lily needed this to work. And if Sarah had found a way, some way, he'd be a fool to refuse it on principle. Okay, he said. Sarah smiled. It was a small smile, sad around the edges, and it transformed her face in a way he'd seen before, but never thought to question. She looked, for just a moment, like someone used to winning. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. She left the kitchen, taking the folder with her. Mark stood alone with his coffee, listening to the sounds of the building settling, the distant traffic, the hum of Lily's oxygen machine. Through the kitchen window, the light in the apartment across the air shaft went dark. He watched the empty window for a long moment, then turned away. He had 17 hours before the launch event. 17 hours to decide if he was ready to risk everything on a promise from a woman who might not even be who she said she was. But then, he'd already lost everything once. Maybe the second time would hurt less. Or maybe it would hurt more, and he'd just stopped caring about the difference. The morning came too quickly, and too bright. Mark woke to Lily standing beside his bed, her small hand on his shoulder. She was breathing hard, her lips tinged blue, the way they got when she'd moved too fast or tried too hard. "Dad," she whispered, "I'm scared." He pulled her up onto the bed, held her carefully. She weighed almost nothing. The doctor said she'd stopped growing properly 6 months ago, that her body was redirecting all its resources to keeping her heart beating. "What are you scared of?" "I don't know." She pressed her face against his chest. "I had a dream that Mom was someone else. Someone important." Mark felt his heartbeat stutter. "What do you mean, someone else? Like a queen or something?" Lily pulled back to look at him. Her eyes were the same brown as her mother's, her real mother, the one who'd left when Lily was 2, who'd said she hadn't signed up to be a single parent when Mark's career collapsed. Like she was just pretending to be normal. "Sarah's not pretending," Mark said, but the words felt hollow. "Then why does she know things? What kind of things?" Lily's small face scrunched in concentration. "Like how to speak other languages when she thinks I'm not listening, or how to do math really fast in her head, or how she always knows when someone's lying." She paused. "She knows you're scared too. She told me she's going to fix everything." Mark's throat tightened. "When did she tell you that?" "Last night, after you went to the kitchen." Lily's breathing had slowed a little. She curled against him like a cat seeking warmth. "She said today was going to change everything. She said after today, I could have my surgery, and you could stop being sad all the time." "I'm not sad all the time." "Yes, you are." It was said with the blunt honesty of children, the kind that cut because it was true. "But it's okay. I'm sad sometimes too." They lay together in the weak sunlight coming through the window. Mark counted Lily's heartbeats against his ribs, irregular, stuttering, a rhythm that shouldn't exist in someone so young. He thought about the folder Sarah had shown him, the code fragments, the certainty in her voice, the way she'd moved through the apartment like someone used to commanding space they didn't appear to own. "Lily," he said quietly, "what language does Sarah speak when she thinks you're not listening?" Lily thought about it. "I don't know. It sounds pretty. Lots of R sounds. French," Mark thought. Or maybe German. Languages that required education, travel, a life before the one she claimed not to remember. He filed it away with all the other inconsistencies he'd been too tired or too desperate to examine. Sarah appeared in the doorway, already dressed in the worn jeans and faded t-shirt that constituted her entire wardrobe. "Breakfast," she said. "I made pancakes." Lily scrambled off the bed with more energy than she should have had, than her damaged heart should have allowed. Mark watched his wife watch his daughter, saw something in her expression that was fierce and protective and somehow distant all at once, like she was looking at Lily through the scope of a plan only she could see. They ate pancakes that were perfect, golden, fluffy, exactly the right ratio of crisp to soft. Mark had never asked Sarah where she learned to cook, had never asked her much of anything, he realized now. He'd been so focused on his own catastrophe that he'd forgotten. Catastrophes had witnesses, and witnesses had their own stories. "I have to go out today," Sarah said, pouring orange juice into mismatched glasses. "Some errands." "What kind of errands?" She smiled, and again Mark saw that flash of something else beneath the surface. The kind that get things done. After breakfast, Sarah left. She took nothing with her, except her phone and a small bag Mark had never seen before. Black, expensive-looking, completely incongruous with everything else she owned. She kissed Lily goodbye, touched Mark's face with a tenderness that felt like farewell, and then she was gone. Mark spent the day with Lily, watching movies she'd seen a dozen times, reading books they both knew by heart. The routine was comforting in its predictability. But underneath it, Mark's mind kept circling back to the evening ahead, to the launch event, to whatever Sarah had planned. At 6 p.m. his phone rang. Unknown number. Mr. Miller? A woman's voice, professional, clipped. This is Rebecca Morgan from Apex Technology. Mr. Vane has requested your presence at tonight's launch event. There will be a ticket waiting for you at the security desk. Mark's hand tightened on the phone. Why? Mr. Vane didn't say. He just said to tell you he's counting on your expertise. A pause. Will you be attending? Everything in Mark wanted to say no, wanted to hang up, to stay home, to keep his head down the way he'd learned to do. But then he looked at Lily, saw the oxygen line running to her nose, the paleness of her skin, the careful way she breathed. And he thought about Sarah's certainty, about the folder, about the code that was his, that had always been his. I'll be there, he said. Rebecca Morgan gave him the details and hung up. Mark stared at his phone, feeling the trap close around him. Sarah had known. Somehow, impossibly, she'd known Julian would call, which meant she'd orchestrated this, or known someone who had, or was someone other than the woman who'd spent 3 years collecting cans for recycling money. The babysitter arrived at 7, a neighbor girl who Lily liked, who knew about the oxygen, about the medications, about what to do if Lily's lips turned blue. Mark gave instructions he'd given 100 times, kissed his daughter, promised he'd be home soon. Dad, Lily called as he reached the door. Tell Mom I love her. She's not there, sweetheart. She's running errands. Lily smiled. She'll be there, she promised. Mark didn't argue. He rode the subway into Manhattan, watching his reflection in the dark windows. He'd worn the only suit he still owned, a charcoal gray that didn't fit quite right anymore, too loose in the shoulders, too tight in the waist. The tie felt like a noose. He loosened it as the train swayed through tunnels, through stations, through the geography of his old life. The Apex building looked exactly as he remembered it. Glass and steel, 49 floors of ambition reaching into the night sky. Security at the front desk checked his ID, handed him a badge marked Guest, directed him to the elevators. The lobby was full of people in expensive clothes, carrying expensive phones, laughing at expensive jokes. Mark took the elevator to the 47th floor. The doors opened onto chaos, barely contained by catering staff and event coordinators. The entire floor had been converted into a launch venue, stage at one end, screens everywhere, tables laden with food. Mark hadn't eaten in 3 years. 500 people filled the space, and Mark recognized most of them. Former colleagues, investors, tech journalists, the ecosystem that had once included him and now pretended he'd never existed. Mark Miller. Julian's voice cut through the ambient noise. He appeared at Mark's elbow, drink in hand, smile sharp. I wasn't sure you'd actually come. You asked for me. I did. Julian steered him toward the edge of the crowd, away from listening ears. Look, I know things between us are complicated, but tonight's important. This Omni system, it's going to change everything. Put Apex back on top, and I want you here for it. Why? Mark kept his voice flat. Julian's smile didn't waver. Because you're still the best there is, and because I'm not a complete bastard, whatever you think. Your kid needs surgery, right? 80,000? Mark's hands clenched. How do you know that? I know everything that happens in my building, including what my janitors say when they think no one's listening. Julian took a sip of his drink. Here's the deal. You stay through the presentation. If anything goes wrong with the demonstration, and nothing will, but if it does, you help fix it. Quick and quiet. In exchange, I'll write you a check for the full amount. No strings. It was exactly what Sarah had predicted. Exactly. Mark felt the floor shift under him, reality reorganizing into something that didn't quite make sense. And if nothing goes wrong, then you get the money anyway. Call it a goodwill gesture. Julian's eyes hardened. But Mark, if you fuck this up, if you try to embarrass me or sabotage anything, I'll make sure you never work in tech again. Not as an engineer, not as a janitor, not as anything. We clear? Mark nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. Julian clapped him on the shoulder. Great. Grab some food. Enjoy the show. And Mark? Glad you're here. He walked away, leaving Mark alone at the edge of the crowd. The demonstration was scheduled for 8 p.m. Mark checked his watch, 7:45. 15 minutes. He scanned the room, looking for Sarah, but she wasn't there. Of course she wasn't. She had no business being here, no connection to this world except through him. The lights dimmed. People moved toward the seating area. Mark stayed standing, positioned himself near the back where he had a clear view of the stage and the exits. Julian took the microphone, launched into his presentation. He was good at this. Charismatic, funny, self-deprecating in a way that was actually self-aggrandizing. The crowd laughed on cue, applauded on cue, believed everything he said because he said it with confidence. And now, Julian said, the moment we've all been waiting for. The Omni security system, completely unhackable, completely autonomous, completely revolutionary. The massive screens lit up. Code scrolled past. Mark recognized every line. His architecture, his logic, his work, presented as Julian's innovation. The crowd oohed and awed. Someone whistled. Julian smiled like a man who'd already won. And then the screens went black. Not a gradual fade. An instant cut to darkness. The code disappeared. In its place, a single line of text appeared in white. System compromised. The room went silent. Julian's smile froze. He turned to the screens, then to his tech team positioned offstage. Someone was typing frantically on a laptop. The screens flickered, showed static, then displayed something worse, Mark's original code. Side by side with Julian's modified version. Timestamps showing when Mark had written it, 3 years ago. Timestamps showing when Julian had copied it, 2 years, 11 months ago. And under it all, financial records. Bribes to Mark's lawyer. Payments to the Korean firm that had supposedly bought Mark's secrets. Bank transfers that proved everything had been manufactured. What the fuck is happening? Julian hissed into his microphone, forgetting it was live. His voice boomed through the room. Shut it down. Shut it all down. But the screens kept scrolling. More evidence. Emails. Contracts. A systematic destruction of Julian's entire narrative, displayed in high definition for 500 witnesses and 50,000 streaming viewers. And then Sarah walked onto the stage. She didn't look like the woman who'd made pancakes that morning. Didn't look like anyone who'd ever worried about day-old bread or recycling cans for deposit money. She wore a black suit that probably cost more than Mark's car, her hair pulled back, diamond studs catching the emergency lighting. She moved like someone who owned the building, maybe because she did. "Good evening," she said into Julian's microphone, her voice calm and clear. "My name is Sarah Sterling. I'm the CEO of Sterling Group, and as of 4 p.m. today, I own 62% of Apex Technologies' outstanding shares." She smiled. "Which makes me Mr. Vane's boss, effective immediately." The room erupted. Voices, phones, confusion. But Sarah raised one hand, and somehow, impossibly, everyone went quiet. 3 years ago, she continued, Julian Vane orchestrated an elaborate fraud to steal proprietary code from one of his own engineers. That engineer is here tonight. Mark Miller, would you come up here, please? Mark's legs moved without his permission. He walked through the crowd, climbed the stairs to the stage. Up close, Sarah looked different. sharper. Like the soft edges he'd known for 3 years had been a carefully maintained illusion. She touched his arm once, lightly, then turned back to the audience. Mark built the system you just saw Julian claim credit for. Mark was framed for corporate espionage to cover up the theft, and Mark has spent the last 3 years working as a janitor in the building he helped design, while his daughter dies from a heart condition because he can't afford her surgery. Sarah's voice never rose, but it filled the space completely. I'm here to fix that. Mark, the system is crashing. Can you recover it? Mark looked at the screens, looked at his code, looked at Julian, whose face had gone pale. Yes, he said. Then do it. Show everyone what you can do. A laptop appeared. Someone, Mark didn't see who, handed it to him. He sat down at the edge of the stage, and his fingers found the keyboard like they'd never left. The code unfolded in his mind, the same way it always had, elegant and clear. He typed quickly, bypassing Julian's modifications, restoring the original architecture, fixing the vulnerabilities that had made the hack possible in the first place. The screens came back online. Clean, secure, functional. The room burst into applause, not for Julian, for him. Mr. Vane, Sarah said, you're terminated. Security will escort you out. The SEC will be contacting you regarding the evidence we've just made public. I'd recommend getting a very good lawyer. 2 security guards appeared at Julian's elbows. He tried to speak, but no words came out. They led him away, through a gauntlet of people who'd been laughing at his jokes 10 minutes ago and were now recording his humiliation on their phones. Sarah turned to Mark. You should go. Your daughter needs you. There's a car waiting downstairs. Dr. Morrison is already at your apartment. She's one of the best pediatric cardiac surgeons in the country. She'll transport Lily to Presbyterian tonight. The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning, all costs covered. Mark stared at her. Who are you? The woman you saved. She smiled, and for a moment, he saw the person he'd found in the rain 3 years ago. Lost and broken and grateful. I had amnesia, Mark. That part was true, but it wasn't permanent. I remembered everything about 6 months after you took me in. She paused. I needed time to make this right, to build enough power to protect you, to make sure when I moved against Julian, he couldn't hurt you anymore. You've been planning this for 3 years? I've been planning this since the night I woke up in a hospital room, and a stranger had paid my medical bills with the last thing of value he owned. Her eyes were bright. You gave me everything when you had nothing. So I'm giving you everything back. Your reputation, your daughter's life, your future. Mark's throat was tight. You're a billionaire. I am. Sterling Group. Tech acquisitions, venture capital. I was driving to a board meeting when I got carjacked. They hit me, took the car, left me for dead. She touched her temple, where a small scar still showed. You found me before I bled out, and you didn't ask who I was or what you'd get in return. You just helped. I need to get to Lily. I know. Go. Sarah stepped back. And Mark, I'm sorry I lied, but I'm not sorry I stayed. Mark turned, walked off the stage, through the crowd. People tried to stop him, to shake his hand, to offer business cards. He ignored all of them. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should have. The car Sarah had mentioned was a black sedan, driver already waiting. Mark climbed in. Presbyterian Hospital first, the driver said. Then your apartment. Dr. Morrison's orders. They drove through Manhattan, across the Queensboro Bridge, into the borough, where Mark had learned to be poor. His phone buzzed, a text from the number that had called that afternoon. Lily's stable. Dr. Morrison says she's strong. She'll make it through surgery. Sarah. Another buzz, a different number. Your first board meeting is Monday, 9 a.m. As Chief Technology Officer of Apex, you'll be overseeing the rebuild. Salary and benefits package attached. Don't be late. S. Mark opened the attachment. The number had so many zeros he had to count them twice. He closed his eyes, felt the car's motion, the city passing by outside. Everything had changed in the span of 2 hours. His life had been returned to him, repackaged, upgraded. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing on a cliff edge, looking down at a drop he'd somehow survived once already, and wasn't sure he could survive again. The car pulled up to his building. Mark took the stairs fast, burst into the apartment. Lily was on the couch, looking small and pale but awake. A woman in scrubs sat beside her. Dr. Morrison, he assumed. The equipment around Lily had multiplied. Monitors, IV stands, portable ventilator on standby. Dad. Lily's voice was weak but happy. Mom was here. She said you fixed everything. She was right. Mark knelt beside the couch, took his daughter's hand. We're going to the hospital. You're having your surgery tomorrow. Will it hurt? Not while you're asleep. And after, we'll make sure you don't hurt. He brushed hair from her forehead. You're going to be okay, Lily, I promise. Dr. Morrison stood. We should transport now. I've got an ambulance downstairs. Mr. Miller, you can ride with us. The next 18 hours blurred together. The ambulance ride, the pre-op, the waiting room with its terrible coffee and worse magazines, other parents, other emergencies, other children fighting for futures they deserved but couldn't guarantee. Sarah appeared at some point during the night, back in her faded jeans, her soft voice. She sat beside him without speaking, just present in the way she'd been for 3 years. Mark wanted to ask her everything, about her life before, about Sterling Group, about how she'd engineered Julian's downfall. But the questions felt less important than the fact of her there, solid and real. Thank you, he said finally. You saved my life first. That was different. I didn't do anything special, just called 911. You stayed. Sarah looked at him. After the ambulance came, you stayed. You visited me in the hospital every day. You let me live with you when I had nowhere to go. You married me so I could have health insurance. You treated me like I mattered when I couldn't remember my own name. She paused. That's more special than you think. The surgery lasted 6 hours. Dr. Morrison came out wearing scrubs marked with Lily's blood, smiling. She's stable. The repair was successful. She'll need to stay in ICU for a few days. But barring complications, she's going to have a normal life. Mark felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been holding together through force of will alone. He put his face in his hands, and Sarah's arms came around him, and he cried, the way he hadn't let himself cry for 3 years. 2 weeks later, Mark stood in his new office on the 43rd floor of the Apex building. His old floor, his old title, more or less. Chief Technology Officer. A team of engineers who looked at him like he was a legend instead of a janitor. A salary that meant Lily would never miss another surgery, another medication, another chance. Through the window, he could see across Manhattan to the river, to the park where he'd found Sarah. The city looked different from up here, cleaner, more possible. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Dinner tonight. Lily wants pizza. The good kind, not food bank kind. Mark smiled. He typed back, I'll pick it up on the way home. He'd asked Sarah, once the chaos settled, if she was going back to her old life. Back to Sterling Group's headquarters, to board meetings, to the world she'd come from. She'd looked at him like he'd suggested she'd jump off a bridge. That's not where I live, she'd said. I live with you and Lily in a 4th-floor walk-up in Queens. Everything else is just business. And so she'd stayed. Still made pancakes. Still read library books about urban gardening. Still moved through their apartment with that careful economy of motion. But now Mark noticed the other things too. The way she spoke 3 languages on business calls, the way her handwriting changed when she signed contracts, the way she could negotiate billion-dollar deals between breakfast and lunch and return home like she'd just been running errands. She was both people. The woman he'd saved and the woman who'd saved him back. And Mark was learning, slowly, to be both people too. The engineer who'd built systems and the father who'd picked up burger scraps for his daughter's life. Neither version erased the other. They coexisted, complicated and human. Lily was home now, recovering in the bedroom that wasn't a closet anymore. They'd moved to a bigger apartment, still in Queens, still a walk-up, but with actual rooms and windows that showed sky. She was doing physical therapy, gaining weight, learning to breathe without oxygen. She'd asked Sarah once, direct and fearless the way 8-year-olds are, if Sarah had always been rich. Sarah had thought about it. "I had money," she'd said, "but I wasn't rich until I had a family." It was exactly the kind of answer adults gave when they were being evasive, but Lily had accepted it because the truth underneath was clear enough. Sarah chose to be there. Every day, she chose them. Mark picked up his briefcase. New, leather. Nothing like the plastic bucket he'd carried for 3 years, but kept anyway, tucked in the back of his closet like a memorial to the man he'd been. He took the elevator down to the lobby, walked out into the autumn evening. Manhattan was lighting up, millions of windows, millions of lives. He bought pizza from the place on the corner that Lily loved, the one with the brick oven and the guys who knew her name now. The cashier handed him the boxes with a smile. "Tell the little one we said hi." "I will." The subway ride home was crowded, but Mark didn't mind. He held the pizza boxes on his lap and watched the stops pass. There was an ad above the window for some new tech startup, promising to revolutionize something or other. Mark read it with professional interest, mentally cataloging the flaws in their value proposition. Old habits. But mostly he thought about dinner, about the 3 of them around the table that wasn't a table, just a card table they'd upgraded to an actual dining set. About Lily's laugh when she told stories from school. She'd gone back to school, was catching up fast, had already made friends. About Sarah's quiet presence, the way she listened more than she spoke, observed more than she participated. He thought about the janitor's bucket in his closet, about the $1,700 he'd earned picking meat off polished stone, about how far he'd fallen and how far he'd climbed back, about how both were true, both were him, and neither was the whole story. The train pulled into his stop. Mark climbed the stairs to street level, walked the familiar blocks to his building. The elevator was fixed now. Sarah had bought the building, fixed everything that was broken, installed proper security. But sometimes Mark still took the stairs, just to remember. Their apartment was on the 4th floor. 3 deadbolts. Inside, he could hear Lily laughing at something, could hear Sarah's softer voice responding. He unlocked the door with hands that didn't shake anymore, that typed code, and held his daughter, and sometimes, late at night, held his wife. "Pizza's here," Lily called out, appearing in the hallway. She was wearing the NYU sweatshirt Sarah had bought her, too big, but she loved it anyway. Her color was good, her breathing easy. She looked like any other 8-year-old, and that was the miracle. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She smiled at him, and Mark saw all of her, the woman from the rain, the billionaire CEO, the wife who made pancakes and plotted corporate takeovers. She was all of it. He was all of it. They were building a life from pieces that didn't match, but fit together anyway. "Good day?" she asked. "Long day," Mark said. "Good, though." They set the table together. Lily chattered about school, about her friends, about the science project she wanted to do. Sarah asked questions that were actually interested, not just polite. Mark ate pizza that tasted better than it had any right to, in an apartment that was warm and full and theirs. Later, after Lily was asleep and the dishes were done, and the city outside had gone quiet in the way it never really did, Mark and Sarah sat on the couch. Not touching, just near. Sharing space the way they'd learned to do, respectful of boundaries and histories neither could fully explain to the other. "Do you ever miss it?" Mark asked. "The amnesia, not knowing." Sarah considered. Sometimes. Not knowing meant not being responsible, not having to carry everything that came before. She looked at him. "But I wouldn't trade it. Knowing you, knowing Lily, that's worth carrying the rest. Even the hard parts? Especially the hard parts." She reached for his hand, laced their fingers together. "The hard parts are what make us real." They sat in the quiet. Somewhere above them, someone was watching TV too loud. Somewhere below, a baby cried. Normal sounds, human sounds, the sounds of a building full of people trying their best to survive, and sometimes, when they were lucky, to live. Mark thought about the bucket, about the marble floor, about Julian being led away in handcuffs, about his daughter's steady heartbeat, about all the things he'd lost and all the things he'd found, and how sometimes they were the same things, just seen from different angles. "Thank you," he said again, because he didn't know what else to say. Sarah squeezed his hand. "Thank you back. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't profound. But it was true, and truth was harder than poetry anyway. They'd found each other in the rain, built a life from nothing, survived catastrophe through stubbornness and luck, and love they'd never quite named but knew anyway. Outside, Manhattan gleamed. Inside, their daughter slept soundly for the first time in 3 years. And in the space between what they'd been and what they'd become, Mark and Sarah sat together, holding on, letting go, learning to be saved and saviors both. The plastic bucket in the closet held 3 years of silence, but the apartment around them held something louder. The sound of breathing, of living, of choosing each other again and again until choice became something deeper than decision. Became home, and that, Mark thought, was enough. More than enough. Everything.